It's about all of these cases, all these true crime, that because that's the thing. There's this push to turning like true crime podcasts to kind of creators need to look themselves in the mirror and not worry about making money in terms of just cashing in on somebody else's misery, and realizing that these aren't stories, these are recounts of somebody's life, and that there's people out there that are still living with that pain every single day, and like I'm hyper cognizant of that. And, and I make sure in my podcast that it's known.
This is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. I'm Jason Blair. That's Bob Motta, a longtime defense attorney and the host of the spectacularly rated true crime podcast, Defense Diaries. Bob has practiced law for 2 decades as a defense attorney. On Bob's 21st birthday, he received what he describes as the strangest and most unique birthday gift he had ever heard of. His father, who had been a defense attorney for the notorious serial killer John Wayne Gacy, gave him a box with tapes between Gacy and his defense attorneys. Bob's father told him to hold on to them because someday he might have a use for them. 31 years later, still in the original box his father gave him, Bob found use for them and started the first season of Defense Diaries, a serialized podcast that's in its 2nd season. The Gacy tapes included gems like when Gacy was asked whether he blamed his victims, and he said, quote, "Yes, there's not one of them who did not die that I'm aware of that did not die through their own hand, through their own wrongdoing." What caused season 1 of Defense Diaries to stand out was that Bob did not focus on true crime gore surrounding Gacy, but instead used the tapes as an avenue to tell the stories of the investigation and the victims, whose lives are, after all these years, little explored. In Bob's 2nd case, he turned to the story of one of his own clients, Dr. Anthony Garcia. Garcia was accused of murdering people and their family members. He was said to have held responsible for derailing his career by getting him fired from Creighton University. The Garcia case began on March 13th, 2008, in the Dundee neighborhood of Omaha, Nebraska, when Dr. William Hunter came home to find his 11-year-old son, Thomas, and the 57-year-old woman who cleaned their house, Shirley Sherman, brutally murdered. 5 years later, a piano moving crew arrived at the home of Dr. Roger Brumback to find him and his wife, Mary, both dead. A few days later, another Creighton doctor's home was broken into. The police found a firearm that would fit the magazine that was found in the foyer of the Brumbacks. Dr. Garcia's credit card was used twice in the area of the Brumback murders. Questionable internet searches were found on Garcia's phone and a suspicious to-do list beside a copy of his termination letter. A jury convicted Dr. Garcia in 2016, and he was put on death row. But Bob's podcast raises questions about whether the jury got it right. A graduate of Chicago-Kent College of Law at the Illinois Institute of Technology and Eastern Illinois University, Bob also has a side pod called The Docket, where he tackles interesting cases such as the Adnan Syed case in Maryland, the Delphi Murders in Indiana, and the murders of the 4 college students at the University of Idaho. He tackles this from a non-traditional perspective of someone who's been on the defense side. Today, we're going to talk about Gacy, the Garcia case, and some of the cases in the news, as well as Bob's approach to defense work and the unique perspective he brings to podcasting and true crime, being a part of the defense bar, and his balanced approach where he focuses more on the rule of law and logic than the salacious details. So, Bob, I just wanted to thank you so much for joining to talk about what it's like to be a defense attorney, what it's like to be a podcaster in this space. And I don't know if you really know this, but the way I first came across you was I was listening to the Prosecutors Podcast, which is a really great podcast by Bob and Alice. And it's one I recommend to a lot of people. You came on as a guest, and I just thought to myself, this is the first time in the true crime world, whether it's television or podcast, that I heard a defense attorney really articulate the purpose of defense lawyers in our democracy and our society. And that just really captured my attention. So I'm really glad to have this opportunity to talk to you.
Hey, man, and I'm thrilled to be here. And you and I kind of met. You had engaged me on Twitter, and I really appreciated the things that you were tweeting at me, man, because, it's one of those things where, I know what the perception of defense attorneys is generally, so when you kind of reached out to me, that struck a chord with me, and I'm always super appreciative of people that do that because it lets me know that I'm being heard and that what I'm saying is being taken as how I want it to be heard. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's resonating with people. So I appreciate that. Yeah. And Brett and Alice are great, and like when I started in the game a couple of years ago, I had reached out to them early. I was a fledgling pod, they were already relatively big. So they didn't give me too much traction at that point, but, I think they were keeping an eye on me. And, they were kind of digging into some of the stuff that I was doing. And I think that they kind of realized that, like, hey, this guy is pretty legit in terms of, bringing the opposite perspective, and he does it in a way that's respectful. So I think that they appreciated that. And, then Brett hit me up and he's like, yo, you want to jump on? I was like, been waiting, dude, patiently. So, yeah, we started doing some collabs together, and we've done a few things together, and I always enjoy hanging with those two. So yeah. And in terms of my message, and like I was telling you off air that I told you that I talk about on air, in terms of trying to figure out when I was getting into the podcast, and I know that you gave an intro, and I've been practicing law for 20 years. I've been a full-blown trial attorney, criminal defense side of it, and it's a soul-crushing profession. It is. Yeah. It's like there's the amount of weight that you carry as a defense attorney in particular. I don't know that there's any profession on the planet that you carry that much weight, and it's in the sense that I have the weight of the world on my shoulders, in the sense that I am representing somebody whose either life and or liberty is at stake. And in our lives, aside from health, I don't know that there's anything more important than those two things. And obviously life and health intertwined, but that liberty side of it, in terms of, if they're looking at, a term in prison or whatever the case may be, it's a lot to deal with. It's like putting aside the horrors of the case itself, just understanding what's at stake and the fact that you can never turn it off. It's not like when I walk out of a courtroom, I'm done working for the day in the middle of a trial. It's quite the opposite. I mean, I'm just getting started, because then I'm preparing for the next day. I'm trying to figure out who the state, whether if they're playing nice or not. A lot of times they don't tell me who they're going to be calling and in what order. So I'm having to try to guess from a witness list of 50, 60, 70 people who they're going to be calling. So I'm trying to prepare cross-examinations, going through all the records, police reports, the evidence, and trying to, craft a cogent cross-examination. And so your mind's just constantly on it. It's like, like in terms of tunnel vision, that's like where I'm at. So after 20 years, man, I was burnt. Like there's no other way to put it, and I can't put it any other way. And that becomes a dangerous proposition as a defense attorney, because like my wife and I, who's my partner, we like to think of ourselves as attorneys who give voice to the voiceless, because we do represent the people, make no mistake about it. The prosecution is the government. and like it, and if you think of it in terms of like that,
They call them sort of like the people versus, but I always like
but it's the people of the state,
right,
of Illinois. So like that, they kind of leave that of the state part off, and people kind of forget that.
Well, it's like I remember reading and that Twitter conversation with you. One of the things that struck me about it was I kind of had I don't remember the exact topic, but I had a bit of a opposing position, but you were willing to engage and have the conversation, and it was really kind of it was just interesting that you were willing to have that. But you had this tweet recently that said something like, the thing is, defense attorneys defend we the people. And I thought that was just an interesting construct that really on both sides of the aisle, the defense attorneys and the prosecutors are working for the people. Is that
right?
Fair?
Yeah, in a way, you know what I'm saying? I mean, like the prosecutors theoretically are working for the victim, right? And we are working towards making sure that the Constitution is being applied appropriately and fairly and justly to all of the people. So it's different. Like, and the bigger thing beyond that is that, what defense attorneys do is we make sure to stave back any kind of government tyranny, because the fact of the matter is if you have cops who are out there doing dirty, if they're violating people's constitutional rights, and it like people that are kind of like, well, I'm not a criminal, it doesn't matter, because I don't break the law. Well, the reason that you can feel that secure in that particular like realm, that you don't have to worry about it, is because defense attorneys are calling cops and government agencies that violate constitutional rights by doing those things that people call technicalities, like where, say, for instance, we have a case where, we filed a motion to suppress because we found that they violated the defendant's Fourth Amendment rights in terms of either getting the warrant, or it was a warrantless search, that there was no probable cause, all those things that matter so much to all of us as citizens, that stop the cops from being able to just kick anybody's door in, to be able to pull you over and search your vehicle without any kind of probable cause. So when we call them out on that, okay, and we say, look, you did this dirty, and if it turns into a thing where the judge says, you know what, you're right, you violated their constitutional rights, and I'm going to suppress the evidence, that bite, that real bite, instead of it just being a bark where it has an actual impact, and then the state then loses the evidence, that is a deterrent for that cop to do it the next time. So without criminal defense attorneys filing those motions that people call technicalities, which are actually the Constitution, we're living in a much different country. So, like, the way that I put it in simple terms is we police the police, and if we're not there to do it, there's no one there to do it. You could say, well, what about internal affairs? That's a conflicted thing altogether when you think about it. So yeah, it's different. They do kind of represent the people, but we represent the people. They represent the rights of victims is what they do. We represent society.
There's that saying about cops, the thin blue line. I think with defense attorneys, right? Like, maybe it's not the thin blue line, but it's the line between us and having our liberties arbitrarily taken. If you think about the average prosecutor's life, tons of cases, all sorts of things going on. Expediency is a huge part of their job. Right. Not necessarily looking at all the evidence, that if they, and I have friends who are prosecutors, and they'll say they pay attention to cases very differently based on who the defense attorney is on the other side of it.
Right.
And that was striking to me.
Right.
And, you were kind of alluding to that idea that defense attorneys are kind of maligned until, of course, you need one.
Right.
Yeah. And I was wondering what attracted you to defense law? I know your father was a defense attorney.
Yeah, it's a great question. And yeah, I mean, obviously on the forefront, it was my dad, but I grew up in a town called Oak Park, Illinois, and it was and continues to be a very progressive town in terms of thinking. I was fortunate enough to grow up in an area that was truly integrated. I came out of that town thinking right about things in terms of the world at large, which gave me a huge advantage in terms of like, I can be in any situation and feel in complete comfort. You know what I mean? Which is a rare thing. I mean, there's a massive part of this country where that's simply not the case, where, people do, so it's like I'm socially and, like equality wise, extremely liberal. Like my biggest thing is, like without getting into politics at all, because I never touch it on my podcast. But to me, the biggest thing on the table in terms of this country is equality for everybody, whether it be based on color, whether it be, based on gender, whether it be, based on sexual preference, whatever the case may be. I don't care, because everyone should be on the same level playing field, period. And no one is ever going to convince me otherwise, ever, because that's the wrong way to think. There is no right answer from that side of it, period. So like for me, that's always the basis of it. And, what I started to realize, I was a sociology major, man, which is incredibly useless in terms of like, unless you want to be a professor or a social worker.
Sociology, right?
Yeah, right. And I was a social worker for 5 years, before I went to law school, because I wanted to work with people and I wanted to help people. And, what I realized early on as a young man is that in particular, because of where I had the advantage of growing up, is that people of color, were being shit on.
Right.
Like from the onset of this country. And I took great offense to it. And there was no part of me that was going to have any hand in putting a disproportionate amount of people of color in prison based on bullshit.
What did you see when you were doing social work? I know Oak Park's outside of Chicago, right?
Right. It's actually it's a very urban suburb. It's 8 miles. It's the first suburb out of the city of Chicago. Like I grew up like on the Austin area is underserved area, high crime area, low income. And, so I grew up like right on that street. So like right on Austin. So I saw everything, like I saw like the realities of poverty and what it can drive people to do. I saw the reality of how poverty can then turn into addiction, whether it be drugs and alcohol, and how that interplays with mental health and all these things that are just realities in our society that what I found were being completely ignored by the government and by the prosecution in terms of, when they're deciding whether or not to charge somebody, or they're deciding whether or not to offer somebody a plea and what that plea looks like in conjunction to what was done. And, so all those things kind of just like added up to me to a point where, when I'm a social worker, and funny enough, man, I had come out of college and I was trying to get a job as a white male with the Department of Children and Family Services. I wanted to work with kids. I wanted to help kids. I wanted to get kids out of bad situations, and I would have been great at it. And I went and took the state exam 3 times and got 100% all 3 times. And I could not get an interview with DCS. Oh, wow. Not one. Took the exam 3 times. So I was starting to get the feeling, and look, social work is a female dominated profession. That's why, of course, they're grossly underpaid and undervalued, because that's how our society is, so I knew I was kind of an odd duck in that particular area of employment. And, so ultimately I got a job with Catholic Charities working with seniors. And like I took a job down in an area called Harvey, Illinois, which is entirely black. Like it's a entirely black suburb, So when I went to go work down in Catholic Charities and I walked in, I was like literally the only white guy that worked in there, and like it was all like older black women, and they loved me. It was like they did they could they could just sense I was a genuine human being and that I was a good person, and they took me in, man, like bear hug style. And I loved that.
It ties back to something very deep, I think, for the Black community. I remember my grandmother telling me, she grew up in the civil rights movement, or not grew up, she was a little bit older in the civil rights movement, but she wants me to point to me that the white journalists and activists and lawyers who came down, who put themselves at risk when they didn't need to put themselves at risk, but also sort of brought that, and not to get political, but the power of their privilege to the discussion was unbelievably impactful. And that always stuck with me.
And it's true, man. Like I would go. So I was a case manager. All right. And I like, my job was to go out and go to folks' homes and, because they may have called in, and I was either trying to set them up with like Meals on Wheels, or if they needed help, like getting to the market and, because they weren't able to drive, like all those different services that they may need, and I'd go in, I'd do the intake. And, so when I was down in Harvey, like I'd go into I'd knock on the door, and like a nice older lady would open it, and, and I'd come in and I'd say, I'm from Catholic Charities. I'm here to help you out. And, and with seniors, most of them really just wanted to talk more than anything.
Right,
they wanted the company, man. So like I was notorious for like making my appointments last way too long because I'd become engaged in conversation, because I like to listen to people and I like to engage, and I want to hear them, and I want them to feel heard. It was important to me because I could sense immediately that was something that they needed desperately. I felt that I was giving them a service that I was more than happy to supply them with, so it was a win-win in that sense. But, I'd go in and, man, I'm telling you, 8 out of 10 of my clients would be like, you know what? I just want to tell you, you're the first white man that's ever been in my house.
Right. And that's so meaningful.
Dude. And I was like, and I said, my hope is that I'm a good representation. You know what I mean? Right. It's like, because that was important to me, but it would give me goosebumps like every time, and it was like, so yeah, I mean, like, so yeah, all that was very formative, even though I was like in my early 20s at that point and had kind of like pushed off law school. I mean, it had always been a concept. My father wasn't like overbearing with like, you got to go to law school. He wasn't that guy. I mean, he was a public defender for years, and then, got the Gacy case, and then he did the, his own private practice for a long time, but he was always a criminal defense guy, so
that being able to see those communities, see that disparity. I remember, formerly, I was a journalist, covered, Manhattan Supreme Court and federal cases. And it always struck me how my friends and people I knew really thought our system was very sort of fair. And I got a window, right? I got a window into it because, I'm talking to the police commissioner and the deputy police commissioner, and we're having these conversations where they're telling me, like, what are the real factors going into this high profile case? Like, you could see the victim mattered, how prominent they were. But when I moved into mental health, there's this one crazy story. I had this client who, like if you picked up the DSM and there were like pictures in it, he was like the classic case of manic depression. His triggers were so high, he would get psychotic. He ended up like in this psychotic break doing this home break-in. And the backstory, the real quick backstory, it was that he broke into the home of a guy who had ran over a kid on the street and had gotten off, right? He had gotten off, really wealthy guy. And, my client had just become really fixated with him. He wasn't trying to do any harm.
Right.
But this, so there was a deal with the prosecutors where he was going to get mental health treatment. And then the victims, the people whose house he broke into, would actually shot him in the ankle during it. But they objected, and then the state all of a sudden moved from like deal to mental health to throwing the book at him, like looking at 20 plus years. And the advice that his family got from his defense attorney was, look, make a huge donation to the head of the county board of supervisors. Mm-hmm. And that'll move it. And I mean, they couldn't afford something like that, but it just made me think this is how our system really works.
Dude,
rigged. Yeah,
absolutely rigged. It's like, and that in terms of talking like at the burnout, because Allison and I realized immediately, like we both came into it. We both were going to be like from the get knew we were going to be trial litigators. I'm a storyteller. I always tell people in my podcast at the end of the day, when you're talking about trial attorneys, you're talking about storytellers.
Right.
That's what it is. It's like, I just tweeted the other day, or I said it in my podcast, like I did something on the Adnan Syed case, that kind of recent development. And I was talking about this fact, but I say it all the time. I'm like, we don't know. Like, two people know what happened. It's the victim, who are no longer with us in the case of a murder.
Yeah. Adnan Syed is the Baltimore County, Maryland teenager who was convicted for the 1999 killing of his classmate, Heyman Lee. She was kidnapped and strangled. He was the one whose story led to the podcast Serial, and whose conviction was vacated in 2016, reinstated in 2019, vacated again in 2022, and reinstated earlier this year.
And the perpetrator. Those are the rest of us are all guessing, for attorneys and law enforcement, it's an educated guess, but it's still that. So like when people try to give me definitives, I reject it, because it's like, you can't know. Now, if there's some smoking gun evidence, if we have some incredibly strong direct evidence, that's a different thing, but that's not most cases. Most cases are circumstantial, where you're having to put pieces together. So as much as I love Brett and Alice, they're way too definitive on acting like they know what happened when they don't. Can they put together a persuasive argument? Yeah, but it's just that. It's not fact. I mean, they can
always just some best guess, right?
Yeah, so I mean, but at the end of the day, I understand that it's a story. You know what I'm saying? Like that, like me practicing and being a trial attorney for 20 years and really trying cases. Like a legitimate trial attorney. I've tried some unbelievable cases. Coming into that knowing exactly what it is to be a trial attorney and understanding the concept that at the end of the day, at the heart of it, trial attorneys are storytellers, because that's what you're trying to do, is impart the story that you believe actually happened or is as close to what actually happened to the jury, and trying to get them to come to your side of it and to think, look, because it's like, again, we just don't know. It's like all the cases, like, it tortures me. Like cases where I've tried a case and like I'm sitting there and the jury comes back in a way that like stuns me, where like Alice and I were like, wow, we nailed that. We killed that. And then they come back with a guilty. We're like, what happened? Like, what is going on? So it's like, yeah, man, it's crazy.
I was just thinking, you go to a crime scene, right? You talk to 5 people who witnessed it, right? And there are 5 different stories.
Yep.
Like, so no one really, really knows at the end of the day what happens in a lot of these situations. Why'd you decide to make
eyewitnesses are the worst?
Terrible.
They really are. Like
terrible.
in terms of like direct evidence, and that's what they consider direct evidence. Like an eyewitness is considered direct evidence, whereas like circumstantial is like the probably the most commonly used analogy is like you go to bed, there's no snow on the ground, you wake up, there's 3 inches of snow on the ground, even though you didn't see it happen. You know that it snowed overnight, right? So that's circumstantial evidence. Whereas direct is you're actually, you've got an eyewitness who saw something. Now, when you factor in everything that's involved with an eyewitness in terms of whether or not they're the victim, and like trying to take in like the considerations of, was it a gun? And are you looking at the gun, or are you looking at the person who shot you? More often than not, they're looking at the gun. If you've got witnesses that are, seeing something happen, if there's a gun involved, were you ducking? Like how good of a look did you get? If it's not like a murder where something horrific happens and it's just kind of like a robbery, and or if you're just a witness who saw somebody that you later find out is being accused of something, and at that moment in time you have no reason to commit anything to memory as to what that person looked like or what they were wearing. How much faith can you put in that recount? You know what I'm saying? It's a different thing if you're playing the game concentration and you're trying to remember where the 2 cards that match are on the board.
You're focused on every detail.
Because that's you're doing that when you're in a situation where you just see somebody walking by and it's just a day and you have no reason to commit that person to memory. But then you find out on the news, like, oh my God, I was there. Yeah, I may have seen this guy, and then you go and you give it's like it's just not it's not reliable evidence, and it's always like that. It's the worst evidence there is in my
That
estimation.
makes me think of like the University of Idaho case last year where 4 college students were murdered in, in their house. And there was we found out when the probable cause affidavit came out that there was a witness, and that whole story is bizarre. And there's way more to that.
Yeah, so with that case, like that is in one of my positions, which surprises people sometimes. But like, and look, everything's got to go to trial. I'm huge on innocent until proven guilty, but that guy gives me the vibe that he's the guy, and I can tell that he can. Like, I won't say that guy's name. Like, I never say it in my podcast. I never tweet. Like, I will not give that guy what I know that guy in
probably
wants. So like I just call him but yeah, that like exactly. Like, I did an entire episode about that particular witness when I was going through the PCA, because we were getting a very different story from law enforcement initially. And when you start to pick apart, what they wrote in the PCA, I then begin to wonder how much of that was actually what she had said or how much of that was what she was fed. Because when you look at when that case broke, and initially it was like, well, how are there 2 surviving roommates? And they had both of them, if you'll remember, that they were asleep down on the first floor. It wasn't until the PCA came out that we came to learn that allegedly she was on the second floor, the same floor that like Xana and Ethan were on. And that not only that she allegedly saw the killer.
Xana and Ethan, or Xana Kernoodle and Ethan Chapin, the University of Idaho students who, along with their classmates, Madison Mogan and Kaylee Goncalves, were stabbed to death in the middle of the night in their home about 100 feet off the University of Idaho campus.
So it became a much different thing.
And that the killer walked right by her and she noticed the bushy eyebrows.
Right. And, and it's theoretically it's dark and she sees that he's got some kind of mask on and, and it's like, well, if she saw him close enough to see the bushy eyebrows, you would assume that he probably saw her, and why is she still alive? And, but then when you kind of like really dig into it and like, with the no call until noon the next day to 911, and then it starts to come out that there were tons of kids in that house for hours prior to calling law enforcement. That case is going to be a mess. I'm just telling you right now.
And that's the thing. Like, It's not that, it's not that he didn't do it or that there aren't things that suggest it. But there are things that certainly suggest that there's way more to the story that we're not getting
100%.
That may be favorable to this case.
100%. And frankly, when you see the DNA on the sheath, we're like, oh, done. He did it. You know what I mean? But we don't know anything about that DNA. Like I've had enough DNA cases to where, we know only that it was a single source found on the snap of the sheath, and that's it. We don't know the quality of the sample. We don't know if it's a full or partial sample. There's going to be a lot of litigation about that particular DNA, and they did a genealogical DNA. Like, it's at that point when they did the PCA, it was consistent with his father's. It's like his father could not be excluded as being the contributor, not him. But we all share that YSTR as males. So his YSTR chromosome, like all through the family line, like my YSTR is going to be the same as my great grandfather's, if they were to run our sample. So yeah, it'll be interesting, man. But like, the potential for contamination of that scene is massive. It's going to be a sticky one. We're not going to get to watch it because it's going to be just like they're doing Lori Vallow, like it's Idaho.
In Idaho.
They're going to run the same. They're going to run the same game. And everybody's going to be like disappointed because it was such a huge story, and it's like, oh yeah, like if you listen to one of my docket episodes, and I forget which one it is, but I give a 10-minute diatribe, soapbox style, on the irresponsibility that I saw taking place online and on social media with these, armchair sleuths and, web sleuths and, just people thinking they can crack the cases and accusing people online, from behind their computer, having no access to evidence. And it was reckless. It was scary. And it was like, I had never seen it like that. Like they had the one guy from the Twitch video by the food truck, like
hoodie guy.
The hoodie guy was like the guy.
Convicted.
Like, people were convicted and done. Oh yeah, he drove 5 hours to his parents' home and then he flew to Africa and he's been in high. I'm like, wow, dude. I'm like, can anybody substantiate? Like I was tweeting, I'm like, can anyone substantiate anything that all these people are saying? Where are you getting this information? Or are you just pulling it out of your ass? You know? So I'm like, yeah, like, man, that really disturbed me. And like kind of what I'm seeing and like News Nation kind of grew out of the earth from that case. They blew up. That Brian Enton made his career, that case. He decided, I'm going to go out there and cover that. Guy got he's an anchor now from that case, you know, and it's one of those things where they are reckless. They are reckless in the stuff they report. And there's certain people out there online that are reckless in terms of speculating. Because I'm real big. Like I didn't report on that case at all until the PCA dropped, because I do not do that. Like I am never going to, I am not trying to get like clicks and likes and all that stuff by just speculating on things. I want the facts. I want the evidence. That's the only thing that matters. The rest of it, because it all and I'm so adamant about that because I've been living it for 20 years, trying cases with people that have been predisposed coming into a trial because what they've read in the press.
Well, because the prosecutors get a great advantage because
huge.
They're already investigating the case. They get the PCA out first. So their story, you mentioned the thing about being a storyteller, their story gets told first.
Right. And people don't understand that, Jason. Like people do not get that when everything that you hear in the media initially when a case breaks is all the prosecution's theory of the case. And that's all it is at that point. Unvetted, unchecked. It's what their theory is based on the evidence that they have. And that's all it is. That's the entire point of a trial, is to go in and vet the evidence. Because again, it goes back to my original statement. You know who wasn't at that crime scene? The prosecutor. That's what they're giving.
Or Brian.
Yes. Right. Or Brian Enton. Exactly. Or, any of the other ones that are out there. I'm not going to name names, but you know who you are.
Yes, right. So you mentioned the thing about DNA, which made me think of your second season as Tunnel Vision. It's on the Anthony Garcia case, and he was a doctor. And I'll let you tell the story. But one of the things that struck me about that it's sort of like we live in this CSI world where everyone's been conditioned to believe that forensic evidence is definitive, that it's easy to get. It hurts prosecutors on one hand. But I also think it hurts defendants in another hand because people hear there's DNA evidence without any details about it. And they're like, guilty.
He's the guy.
Yeah. Right.
100%.
So tell me a little bit about why you decided to make the jump into podcasting and a little bit about that Garcia case. Because I think most people, if they know of him, because I know there have been some documentaries, they just think of him as this doctor/serial killer who wiped out,
right.
So many.
Yeah. People. So it kind of like my jump into podcasting it's really been a lifelong journey, like unwittingly, like as a young kid and I was an only child, I used to sit ironically in my room and I would do I have a pretty good radio voice and that comes from me as a kid practicing. I would just do voices and I sat on this old push button recorder and I would make cassette tapes, hours. And ironically, as you note, I think in your intro, when I'm 21, I'm giving all these Gacy tapes of my father's interviews with his then client, John Wayne Gacy, which he recorded on the exact recorder that I recorded 10, 12 years prior as a young boy that he was recording Gacy. So I got these tapes, and then when I went to college, I'm like, I didn't know if I wanted to go to law school. I kind of wanted to get into broadcasting. Kind of at that point, I'm like, it would be a great gig as being a sports broadcaster. Love sports. I'd love to watch and talk about that. That would be a blast. Didn't do it. Got into the social work game. Did the law thing for 20 years, trial lawyer. I was pretty successful at it, in terms of I was a good closing. I gave good closing arguments. I was a pretty compelling lawyer. Sometimes the facts are so bad you just can't win. But that's if they got the evidence, they got the evidence. That's one of the things I always try to tell people. The cops did their jobs right, and they've got the strong evidence. The guy's going to go down.
Yeah, and what does the defense attorney's job become at that moment?
To make sure that the number one, first and foremost, that the defendant received a fair trial and that the Constitution was followed, period. Like, I mean, when you have bad facts, like that's the first lesson my father taught me is like, keep your head down. Like, just make sure that you're like at all costs protecting the Constitution and make sure that your client gets a fair trial, and they all interplay with one another, because like I said, if they've got the facts and they got the evidence and they've done their job properly, they're going to get a conviction. Most criminals are not smart. It's like they're not master. We don't have a bunch of like Moriartys running out here like mastermind criminals.
Right.
Like a lot of times it's spur of the moment. A lot of times if it's even planned, there's mess ups because it's scary committing crime.
Right.
Like unless you're a complete and total sociopath and you're remorseless like Gacy was, like that guy didn't think about anything. Like it was like making a ham sandwich, like killing somebody. It was like that's the most disturbing thing about Gacy. It's like it's impossible to relate to him or even think of him as a human because he just lacks that entire chunk of what makes us human. Like it doesn't exist within him. So like when you listen to those tapes and you hear him talk about, killing these young boys and men, it's like it blows your hair back in a way, not in a good way. It's just like, wow, this guy's. So ultimately, 20 years, I had these tapes. I'd been tinkering with the idea of doing a podcast. I fell in love with podcasting and podcasts in general. I'd always been like a AM radio nerd. Like I always listened to like a lot of talk radio. So I've always enjoyed it. I'm an auditory guy. So when Serial dropped, listened to Serial. I was like, oh my God, this is the greatest thing I've ever heard.
Yeah.
Like, I couldn't have been more engaged. And I listened to it like a couple of years after it was out. Like I wasn't on the front end. It was like, I just kept like when the buzz built, I was like, oh, I'm going to check this out. And I was like, oh, this is amazing. So like it at that point, the seed was planted. And then I had
it's a bit like a documentary without the constraints of time.
Exactly. Dude. That's a perfect description of what a podcast is. It's the doc without the constraints of time where you can really flesh the story out. And like, you're in my second season. Like I'm not doing what is typical in this genre of true crime podcasts where I have an 8 to 12 episode. Both my first seasons are highly personal. My father was Gacy's attorney. That guy was a weird part of my life for 40 years. And I had a lot to tell. And, I was focusing on things that they had never focused on with respect to him. And it wasn't Gacy. I wanted to focus on the victims. I wanted to focus on the investigation. I uncovered just the most mind-blowing story in the history of that case that like somehow was not national news, but is an absolute fact and not a theory that they had planted the most important piece of evidence to get him.
Right. Which is
dude, like it was like when the cop told me that, when I was sitting there in this interview with Mike Albrecht and, and they've all done 50, 60 interviews. And I had pitched Joe Berlinger that idea that he ended up dropping on Netflix. That was my pitch.
Oh, really?
I had reached out to him and said, hey, man, like after he had dropped the Bundy tapes thing under that Conversations with the Killer kind of series that he has going. And I just, as a flyer, I had watched it that night. I picked up my iPad. I Googled him, found his email address, said, hey, I think I might have some tapes that you're interested in. They're much different than anything else that anyone's ever heard because they're not some interview on death row where the guy's just pontificating and, self-flatulating. And, this is an attorney and a defense attorney preparing his client for trial, and Gacy waived privilege because that's how he thought Sam and my father were going to get paid on a book or a movie deal because he had run out of money.
I was wondering about that piece.
Yeah. So and he had waived, so they were free game, in terms of us being able to play the sound. Like, and I didn't have the privilege problem with him, because he wasn't my client, but, I didn't want to get my dad in a jam. You know what I mean? So,
yeah. But
I knew that I've always known that there was the waiver. So that wasn't, so I negotiated with Berlinger for 9 months. And this is all building up to how I got into
back in the early 2000s, right?
Berlinger's thing just came out like last year.
Oh, okay. I was thinking of negotiations.
No. So No, with the tapes? No,
Yeah, yeah.
Gacy was in 78, man. Like that case.
Oh, no. I was just thinking your conversations with Berlinger.
No, yeah, no, Berlinger, this is like 2 years ago, right before I started the
Okay, wow.
pod. So like, I negotiate with them for 9 months. We can't come to a deal on licensing the tapes. The value of the tapes is the sound. Once they're out there, they have no intrinsic value. I mean, yeah, some kind of weirdo collector might want to buy them, but in terms of the true value, it's the sound. It's what's on them. It had never been heard. It's a historic case, in a gross way, but it is. I mean, it's just one of those cases in criminal justice history that is a big one. So I ultimately, and I had been tinkering with the concept of doing a podcast. And so the pandemic hits and I was about halfway through it. And it was the first time in 20 years that I get to step back from the practice of law and breathe and not have the crushing pressure that is on me, like had been like every day of my life, no matter whether it's weekday, weekend, a constant worry, constant anxiety about everything that's going on in your practice, your clients, the cases coming up, trials impending, like that Garcia thing, dude.
Yeah.
For 3 years trying that case.
Oh, yeah.
I thought I was gonna have a nervous breakdown like with that case, because it was a battle to the death between us and the state. Like my job there, they're trying to put my client to death. I am absolutely going to positively make sure that they prove beyond a reasonable doubt that my client did it, because I have to sit there and live with the fact that my client's getting executed. And if I don't do my job to the best of my ability and go as hard as I can, where I can look myself in the mirror and say, hey, you know what? I laid it all out there. I laid
your
it
whole
on
family
was so unturned.
Right?
Oh, dude,
Your whole family.
My wife and my father tried the case with me. Like we haven't even gotten to the part with Allison and they hated us. We were Chicago lawyers. We were out of towners. They looked at us as big city lawyers, and we fought.
How'd you guys even end up on it?
His brother found us. His brother out in California, Fernando, found us, and they liked us. And I have a feeling, because my father was kind of counsel with our firm at that point, that they had Googled like serial killer lawyer. And like, I think that's how we kind of popped up. And then, I had like a long, but that's a different. So at any rate, pandemic hits. I'm in the middle of writing a book. I was writing a fictional true crime book. And, I told Allison, I said, look, because it's a serious conversation. I mean, she's my partner. We have a small boutique firm and we've handled everything together. We do all our trials together. We're a team, like to the core. And I said, look, I want to take a shot at this. I said, I haven't been happy the last 4 or 5 years practicing. It's killing me. It's crushing my soul. I can't live the rest of my life being miserable. I'm like, will you support me? And she's like, of course. I'm like, oh, okay, well, I know you'll do that. But beyond that, like, are you okay with me leaving this massive burden on you of like carrying our practice forward without me being there, man? And it was a huge ask, like Allison forever and ever is the hero of this story. And, so she says, yes, of course I will, and I gave her the promise. I said, look, I am not going to go into this anything other than full bore. Like I am going to put my head down. I'm going to work my butt off. I'm going to do everything that I need to do to make sure that this thing is successful. This isn't going to be some hobby thing, and I'm going to be all in. And, and I knew going in, my first season was going to be Gacy. I had that first source material. What I very quickly realized is I had no technical skill in terms of making a podcast. And and it was obviously important to me if I want to take this massive risk at the age of 50, and leave this practice and like take this chance, that I had to do it right. And I realized immediately that I didn't have the back end side of it to make it sound good. Like I knew I could do the writing, I knew I could do the research, and I knew I could tell the stories, but I couldn't make it sound like a good podcast should sound. So, it's like, I know the horrors that came along with COVID and the shutdown. For me, it was like a godsend, like it was huge. It was everything. It was the break. And then it allowed me to catch my breath and reassess. And then I'm able to, convince my wife to let me to, take the shot. And then I'm like thinking, and I have a lot of friends in the music industry, and I had a buddy down in New Orleans, and he was of course starving to death because he was a sound engineer for, the music industry, and he had not worked in 2 years. Everything was shut down. So I hit him up. I'm like, yo, man, I'm like, do you know what a DAW? a DAW is? He's like, yeah, idiot. I work with one every day of my life. I'm like, oh my God. I'm like, that's amazing. I'm like, hey man, I'm going to do this podcast thing. He's like, I've never even heard a podcast. I'm like, really? I'm like, well, check out a couple of them. I'm like, would you be interested? He's like, I need a producer for it. He's like, book me a ticket. So Darren Wood, who's my producer and my friend before that, but who's amazing, creatively, like him and I are in lockstep. Like I didn't have to tell him how I wanted it to sound. You know what I mean? It's like he nailed the feel in terms of how I wanted it to sound. Because I like my pod is just very different than other true crime pods.
Yeah, and that's actually one of the things that stuck out to me, not just sort of like coming from the defense perspective or telling, looking at it from the perspective of both the prosecution, the defense, and victims, but you do really look at it through the lens of telling a nuanced story, which is sort of part of what, like the criticism of true crime, a lot of criticism of coverage is the nuance is what's missing. And that, I mean, it stuck out to me. I'll tell you a funny story about the Gacy thing, that revelation that they planted evidence when I was working in New York, a detective who was working in public information, who had been this guy, Joe Pentangelo. If you've ever seen Law and Order, the horseback cop, whenever they bring a horseback cop, that's Joe.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he said this, and I don't know if this is a joke or not, but he said, hey, just because they planted evidence doesn't mean they didn't get the guilty guy. And I couldn't tell whether he was joking or not, but that just popped in my mind when you had the Gacy revelation. But to the point about nuance, I had read about the Garcia case before, and I had heard different pieces of it. The cliched killer doctor, except for he was doing it. He wasn't doing it in the hospital, but the nuance in tunnel vision just really struck me, because I went into tunnel vision thinking there's no way this dude is going to get me to think that A, there's any doubt about this case, or B, that anything went wrong in it. And you shifted my opinion.
And in that case, I knew going in, and it's a perfect example of what I was talking about earlier, in the sense that it's a theory, it's a narrative, right? And the state's theory, super compelling, right? I mean, like you hear like how they land on this thing, and like this thing.
Yeah, when I'm hearing your termination letter plus a to-do list that sounds like a murder list is under your sink and DNA is involved, I'm like, okay, guilty.
Right. And wait till I get to the DNA. Like I haven't even gotten to the trial yet. So as you know, because you've listened to the pod, like, I mean, this is going to be a 50 episode podcast, and it's going to be, none of it has been like gratuitous. You know what I mean? Like everything that I put in there, I felt was necessary.
What does Garcia think about you doing it? Does he even know, or
he doesn't even know? Like,
okay,
and that'll be part of it. Like he was, by the time we got to trial, he was so mentally ill. Like that trial should never have gone. We challenged our client's competency 3 times. They were torturing him in there. He was in solitary for 3 years, 23 hours a day in his cell, no human contact.
No one can stay sane or competent.
No one can. I mean, and he was gone. Like we were fighting like cats and dogs. They kept him in solitary. Their rationale was that because he had worked as a doctor in a prison in Indiana for a couple of years, that he had the ability to be able to potentially escape. That was why they kept him in solitary for 3 years. Oh my God, dude. And when we start the Gacy thing, I'd say probably about like 15, 20 episodes, and we get it like a DM from this guy who's like, hey, I recognized your name from the Garcia case, and I just wanted to let you know that I was the nurse in the prison that was administering a tranquilizer to Anthony Garcia.
Really? Did you know about that?
I did not know about it.
Oh, wow.
Like, and dude, like my client slept through his death penalty case. It didn't matter. I tried the hell out of the case. I gave a 4-hour closing argument, and the science, when you start, because here's the thing about Garcia, everything that everyone has heard about Anthony Garcia's case has come from one source, and that's Todd Cooper's book.
Right.
Todd Cooper was an absolute lackey for the state. I had a war with that guy. I'm like, quit trying my client in the press, you scumbag. I'm like, quit doing it. Like you're hurting the chance of the victims getting justice by doing this. You're trying the case in the press because you're being leaked information from the prosecutors.
Who wrote the book? What was it? Pathological.
That's what I'm saying. It's like him and Harry Cordes, whoever.
Yeah.
But Todd Cooper was the beat reporter for the Omaha World Herald.
Mm-hmm.
But this guy was unequivocally for 3 years trying my client in the press. And that's what I'm saying. Like, this isn't my opinion. This is what happened. The prosecution and or law enforcement was leaking the information that he would never have otherwise. And then he would put out double paged, like in the Omaha World Herald, so this guy had Anthony Garcia like in his timeline. He had the entire case, and it was every day for 3 years. Picking our jury for that, it was so polluted, the jury pool. Everyone had heard about the case. Everyone had formed an opinion. Like, we did a poll. Like, I obviously tried to get it out of that county. We filed a motion to change venue immediately. I hired a polling company to poll the good citizens of Omaha and of Douglas County to find out exactly where they were. We crafted 5 questions, and it was a telephonic poll, and it came back that it was stunning. It was like 94% of the people had heard of the case. 90% of them had reached an opinion, and 90% of those people or more all thought he was guilty. So going into voir dire and trying to pick a jury, there's like that. It should never have been tried in that county. It was ridiculous.
How many jurors how many people did you have to go
Hundreds,
through?
Dude. And we didn't, like, typically when you do a voir dire, it's like you do them in panels.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like they'll put like 4 or 6 jurors in a box, and then, we get to do the questioning. The judge will ask the kind of the baseline questions to see if anybody's conflicted out, if they know the defendant or any of the cops or the lawyers and all those types of things. Do you have any kind of, like moral dilemma with the fact that it could be a death penalty case that you don't think that you could be able to sit as a juror? So all those questions are asked, and then we dig into our stuff typically. And then, we can use our challenges, or we can, try to have them removed for cause. Like if they say, no, I think he's guilty and no one's changing my mind. If like we have a guy like that, and the judge will try to rehabilitate him and say, okay, well, I understand that you have that thought coming in, sir or madam. And what I'm asking you is, do you have the ability, despite the fact that you think that right now, do you have the ability to listen to the facts and evidence and then apply the law? And if that person just says yes, the judge considers that person to be rehabilitated. Think about how scary that is.
Yeah.
That person's not rehabilitated.
Right.
That person has formed it. Have you ever had an argument, Jason, online trying to convince somebody about something that you absolutely know is right? And it's like, it's brick wall. It's the same thing in a court of law. It's no different. So with trying to pick that jury, man, we did it individually.
Yeah.
We took people into a room individually.
One by one.
Which is never done, dude. It took forever.
Wow.
And we and then, so to go back to him being tranquilized. So they start rolling this guy out, and he's my client, and he's sleeping, or he appears to be sleeping because he's tranquilized. If you're sitting on a jury during a death penalty case, think about the Murdaugh thing.
Alec Murdaugh is the South Carolina attorney in the South Carolina Low Country who was convicted of murdering his 22-year-old son, Paul, and his wife. He was convicted earlier this year, primarily because he lied about going down to the kennels where they were killed. And his argument was that he lied because he didn't trust the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, or SLED as they're called. He also stole from many, many of his law clients.
And like how all of us were on the sidelines just talking about every single reaction that Murdaugh had. Was he lying? He's, look at his fake crying. Oh, I don't even see tears. It's just snot coming out of it. So imagine if you're a jury and you're looking at a guy sleeping through his death penalty case.
Yeah.
It didn't matter what I said. It didn't matter. It didn't matter the science, which you will hear, didn't in any way support a conviction in this case. Like that, like
How could the judge possibly consider a guy sleeping during his penalty phase as being able to effectively assist his counsel?
dude, like, and we tried it right. He had stopped speaking to us for the 6 months leading into trial. And remember, it took 3 years to get it. Like, not, and when I say not speak, I mean not a word. He did not say. He went through his entire trial and didn't say one word to us during the entire trial, which is unheard of.
Right.
And it's either one of two things. It was the greatest show of willpower in the history of mankind.
Seriously doubt that one.
Yeah. Or it was true. Like, he was incompetent. Because I once again challenged it right before trial, and I made that exact argument that you just said. And
did they say he was malingering?
Yes. That's what they said. That's exactly what they said.
Wow.
So, so man, it was, that case was something else, and it's like, it's that narrative that they came up with is just compelling, and there's red flags for certain. Like, like going into that season, I was very clear. Like, first of all, like I had to blow away the concept that defense attorneys don't care about the victims. That is absolutely untrue. Like, I'm an empath through and through, and every case devastates me when there's somebody that's lost their life. It's like, and you could tell when you listen to my podcast how much respect I give to the victims and memorializing who they were, and who they were to everybody, and just
you tell their stories.
Yeah, man. Because it's important. It's what the case is really about. It's about all of these cases, all these true crime. Because that's the thing. There's this push to turning like true crime podcasts to kind of creators need to look themselves in the mirror and not worry about making money in terms of just cashing in on somebody else's misery. And realizing that these aren't stories, these are recounts of somebody's life, and that there's people out there that are still living with that pain every single day, and like, I'm hyper cognizant of that, and and I make sure in my podcast that it's known, so, but that case, I went into it, I'm like, look, like, and I say it in the first episode, this isn't going to be me standing on my soapbox, like framing it in a way where I'm keeping out key pieces of the prosecution's case. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to lay out every bit, the good, bad, and the ugly of the state's case in terms of bad evidence for me and my client. You're going to hear it all. However, for the first time, other than the people that were sitting in that courtroom, all of you are going to hear the defense, because no one heard it. No one heard it in Todd Cooper's book. No one heard it in the Omaha World Herald as the trial was going on. No one heard it in the Dateline that I did afterwards, or the 2020. No one heard our defense. I mean, I hired, dude, like, this case is unbelievable. Wait till I get to the trial.